Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our August 14th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode will make you rethink Farm Bureau. Those of you who have been listening to this podcast for a while know that our organization supports farmers in a wide variety of ways, but you might not know about our work to support other rural entrepreneurs who are working for a stronger Iowa. Renew Rural Iowa is an Iowa Farm Bureau program that has offered education, mentoring, financial assistance, and recognition to rural Iowa businesses for nearly 2 decades now. And, as you're going to hear shortly, that could include a retail shop, a local manufacturer, or even a company that's using algae to treat water for cities. For more on that, let's talk to the guy who leads that Renew Rural Iowa program, Adam Koppas. Adam recently sat down with spokesman editor Tom Block to talk about one of Renew Rural Iowa's great offerings for entrepreneurs, the Journey to Your Vision seminar. Here's Tom with Adam Koppas.
Adam, thanks for joining me today to talk about some educational workshops that Farm Bureau is sponsoring for entrepreneurs and small businesses in rural Iowa. Tell us about these upcoming Journey to Your Vision seminars.
Yeah, Journey to Your Vision is our half-day peer-to-peer learning seminar that we facilitate in conjunction with local economic development and local leadership. And what they are designed to do is get business owners and business management all in the same room, working through various stages of growth that a business will see as they go from an idea to 1 to 5 employees to 5 to 50 employees and so on and so forth. So there are some common hurdles that folks will encounter as they get going and as they keep building. And this is merely designed to kind of point them out and to help folks learn from one another how to overcome those hurdles and how to continue to grow their business.
And we have 3 upcoming seminars. Can you just give us some details on the locations and timing of these?
Yes, so the upcoming ones for this year, we have one in Waverly at the Waverly Civic Center. That is on August 16th. And that again, half day, usually from about 8 o'clock in the morning till a little after lunch. These are free for everyone. We underwrite the cost of everything. So encourage folks in the area to attend the Waverly session at the Waverly Civic Center on August 16th. We also have one for Central Iowa here that we're hosting at the Iowa Farm Bureau on August 22nd. And then we have one in Storm Lake at Buena Vista University on October 24th. And then if these happen to not be, within a reasonable drive for whoever's listening, just be aware that we rotate these around all over the state, try to hit every nook and cranny every year. So there will be more upcoming as we roll into the new year.
And you mentioned some of the things, the networking and the discussions that could be involved at these seminars, but who should attend? What kind of businesses are you targeting? You mentioned maybe all the way from startups to established businesses. Is there something for everyone, or is it more targeted to one or the other?
Yeah, you'll generally see small business. So this can be anything from a local farmer's market operation to a retail shop on Main Street to even a manufacturing firm in town. Generally speaking, this is anywhere from idea stage to usually less than 50 employees. That's really the target area, and that's really where the kind of common identified hurdles that will be discussed in the seminar, that's really what the focus is on.
And these are led by some very knowledgeable business people. Just talk about who's going to be leading these workshops.
Sure. We've partnered with a number of statewide organizations, but in particular, the folks that lead this are Veal Holding Consultants out of Pella. They do this every day for their full-time job, and they basically have a passion for helping small business, and this is kind of what they do.
And it seems to me, as I travel around the state and talk to farmers and other small business owners, there's been a new flourish of people who want to maybe start their own business. Do you see that out in the state? Like just kind of this energy, people wanting to be local produce their own product and get out there in the market, and maybe technology helps with that.
Yeah, it really feels like there is activity that is taking place around the state. You can't really focus on one particular area because it seems to be happening across the board. Where folks are, they're sort of looking at the resources around them and they're saying, hey, I can make something out of this and not just sell it locally, which is great. That's wonderful. But also, I can look to maybe sell into a regional area, tri-state area, or even nationwide. And the beauty of the internet is you can create a product and put it on the internet and sell it the next day if you really want to. So there is some technology aspect that has kind of unlocked that. But in general, I think folks are just energized by the flourishing economy here in the state, and they're ready to go.
When you look at that current operating environment, as we just discussed, what are some of the most common challenges that you're seeing for these businesses?
Yeah, well, inflation is obvious to everyone, I think. That impacts the cost structure of operating a business, and hiring has always been a challenge that you'll hear. Just locating talent within a region or within an area has always been difficult, but I'm sort of an optimist, and I sort of place the faith in our entrepreneurs here in the state that they work very hard to overcome those challenges, and they do a very good job.
Yeah, if you have a good idea and a good business plan, that can help overcome.
Yes, sir.
How can people sign up for these seminars? Or as you mentioned, if these times don't work, get more information about the services that Renew Rural Iowa offers?
Sure. The easiest way is to go to our website, renewruraliowa.com. There are sign-up links for each session currently hosted on the website. So renewruraliowa.com. You can just click a couple buttons and get logged in and get signed up. Beyond that, renewruraliowa.com, as well as our social media accounts, if you follow them or happen to follow them, we continue to post upcoming events as they come around. So if these, again, don't happen to be in your area, stay tuned because there will be one in your area soon enough.
Very good. Adam, is there anything else that people should know?
No, we just love seeing all the activity in the state and want it to keep continuing, so we are here to help in whatever way that we can.
RenewRuralIowa.com is the place to find those Journey to Your Vision seminars that are coming up mid-August through October. And, as Adam mentioned, if you're not seeing an upcoming seminar in your area of the state right now, keep checking back for new locations. In fact, they just announced a new Journey to Your Vision seminar in Burlington on October 9th. So stay tuned for more of those seminars coming to a location near you. The website is also a good place to get familiar with the other services that Renew Rural Iowa offers entrepreneurs. From mentoring and education to financial assistance and recognition, Renew Rural Iowa is here to help businesses take their next step forward. And our next guest knows all about it. Dr. Martin Gross is the co-founder, president, and CEO of a company based in Slater, Iowa called Gross Wind Technologies. Dr. Gross has a fascinating business that, since its inception, has really tapped into the services that Farm Bureau offers, and he's going to tell us more about it. For that, let's kick it back to Tom Block.
Martin, thanks for joining us on the podcast today. Let's start by telling your listeners a little bit about Gross Wind and the technology that you've developed for wastewater treatment.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Appreciate you having me on today. So the business is Gross Wind Technologies. We're an algae-based water treatment company. So our customers are generally municipal wastewater treatment plants, small cities and large cities, as well as industry, such as food and beverage processing companies will use our technology to remove nitrogen and phosphorus from their wastewater. And really what's unique about our technology is we use algae instead of bacteria and chemicals to treat the water. And that can be a much more sustainable approach to not only clean the nitrogen and phosphorus from the water before it goes to the environment, but also do it using less energy and lowering greenhouse gas emissions during the treatment process.
Can you kind of explain a little bit just how the technology works? I've seen this set up in its pilot stage years ago, but explain for our listeners if you can give them a visual of how it works.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to think about it is think of vertically oriented conveyor belts. So take a treadmill, put it vertical, and basically these conveyor belts rotate into the wastewater, out into the open air, and algae actually grows on the surface of these belts. And then we periodically harvest the algae. So, I know a lot of your listeners are farmers, throughout the state. And think of what we do as basically an algae farmer. So we're basically using this algae system, these vertical belts, to remove nitrogen and phosphorus from the water. But then we have this new crop, which is algae biomass that can be used to make the same things that corn or soy would, being fuels, fertilizers, food, and plastics from it.
How long have you been working on this project? When did the company kind of start, and now you've progressed into commercial applications where it's actually in use? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I guess you have to really look back at my time at Iowa State University, where we invented the technology. So during my PhD studies there, the professor I was working with, Dr. Jio Wen, and myself came up with a new way to grow algae. And we thought, hey, we're going to take this algae system and make biofuels from the algae. And that was, didn't work out economically. But what we found is really good at treating water. So we kind of pivoted to focusing on water treatment. And then when I graduated, we actually started this business. So that was in 2016 when we started the business. Went through the Iowa State University Startup Factory. We were one of the first investments from the Ag Startup Engine. And when I graduated, we started looking to develop the technology, taking it from this university science project to something that's now a commercial system. And it took probably around 10 years to make that cycle. But yeah, we're selling commercial systems now. And I've been doing that for roughly 2 years.
I saw in your press materials that Gross Wind Technology is a more economical choice for especially maybe small town water treatments. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so small towns, we know Iowa's got a lot of them. These small towns use something called a lagoon treatment plant. So if you're driving around the outskirts of any of these small towns in Iowa, you'll see these big open lagoon ponds that's currently being used to treat their water. And what's going on is regulations are getting tighter for these communities. Basically remove more nitrogen than you used to. And these small ponds are great because they're low cost, easy to operate, perfect for the small communities. But if you can't meet your new permits, you need to upgrade them. And that upgrade process tends to be really expensive, puts a big burden on these small cities. So our system, we can come in and instead of getting rid of your pond, which a lot of the other technologies will do, we allow you to keep that pond, and we bolt our system on before it and can help reduce that nitrogen before it goes into your pond. And now you can meet your new permits. So, a good example of this is a project that we did in the town of Slater, Iowa, roughly 1,500 person population, where they got a new ammonia permit, which is a form of nitrogen. And our system was roughly $1 million less in capital cost compared to the alternative technology. And that's in addition to the lower operating cost of our system. So the way that I like to think about how do we reduce operating costs, usually in wastewater treatment, you blow air into water. And blowing air into water takes a lot of energy. So their other alternative was 3 75 horsepower blower motors blowing air 24/7 into the water. And we came in, and instead of using those 3 75 horsepower motors, our belt system uses 3 5 horsepower motors. So you can now understand that every day as these things using energy to treat the water, we're using 3 5 horsepower motors instead of 3 75. So that comes back with electrical and energy savings for the city.
Yeah, I know it's a huge barrier, that cost. We get the press releases, there are EPA grants and things like that over it, but they only cover a portion of it. And these small towns don't have the population to spread that investment out over. So that's a great solution.
Yeah, it definitely helps. I mean, the cost is going to be there. Everyone's looking for the most economical solution, but it's a huge burden for these small cities that don't have the population base. And there's advantages and disadvantages to living in a small town. I grew up in a small town in southwest Iowa, in Logan, Iowa, and you don't want your cities that live in town paying 3 times the water rates as what they do in Des Moines, so these small cities that don't have the population base, you want to keep their sewer bills as low as possible to be competitive, to keep it a great place to live. So it's one of the things I'm passionate about and why that's one of the markets that we were pursuing.
That sounds fantastic. Think about to when you first got started in your studies. What were some of the early challenges the company faced? I guess from the start as a student and then growing it into a viable business, what were some of your early challenges?
Yeah, so if you think about just doing research at the university, like oftentimes it starts at a really small scale, right? A small scale system in a lab on campus. And how much can a system that's 1 foot tall relate to a commercial system that's 20 foot tall, right? Like there's just this scaling issue. So early on during my research at Iowa State, we actually partnered with the BioCentury Research Farm. And what that really meant is taking a system that sat on a bench in a lab on campus and brought it out to the BioCentury Farm, which is a great facility to scale up technology. So we actually built our first pilot scale system in the BioCentury Farm. So like that scaling was the biggest issue at that point, and really some great leadership in the College of Agriculture there to allow us to build this testing facility to scale it up. So that was probably the biggest thing we overcame at the university. But then when I graduated from the university and really started working on the business full time, it's, how do you fund the business? How do you get the capital in the door to do all the things you need to show, the technology works, you can manufacture it, all the things that a startup company needs. And I credit a few different programs to help us through that. First of all, we won grant funding from the USDA. So we won SBIR grants initially, so got federal dollars in to help develop the technology, and went into the Iowa State Startup Factory. And through the Startup Factory, I met a number of our initial investors. And one of those initial investors was a company called the Ag Startup Engine, which is a group of investors. I believe Farm Bureau, through their Rural Vitality Fund, participates there, but it's a group of investors, ag investors, that's focused on making new technology developments. A lot of them are Iowa State spinoff companies like ours.
Yeah, you led right into my next question. I was going to ask what role Farm Bureau played in helping you overcome some of your challenges and aid in the success and development of your company.
Yeah, well, I think along the way, they've been a great advocate. At the core of our business is a water treatment company. It's a big focus of Farm Bureau and the farmers in Iowa's water quality is critically important. So, there was an investment through Ag Startup Engine, which Farm Bureau is a part of. But even before that, there was just support to connect us with communities that needed support to treat their water. And making those connections and being there, from helping us, start the company and think through some key areas. But then later on, they actually made a direct investment through the Rural Vitality Fund, an investment directly into GWT. So now actually Nathan Katzer is a member of the Rural Vitality Fund, is on our board of directors, and actually helps guide our company in a lot of the important decision making that we're doing.
And you've mentioned a couple times the Ag Startup Engine and the Startup Factory. How is that environment and the networking just helpful to companies to get started? How important is that? Well,
like me, I'm a PhD engineer coming out of the university. I had zero idea how to start, grow, make important decisions, in a business. And so I knew I wanted to go through this endeavor. It's a career choice I wanted. But through college, you don't get trained on a lot of these things. So specifically, the Startup Factory was great, like general business overview. This is how a startup company forms and grows, and important decisions along the way, which is important. So if you think of Iowa State being a leading research institution, developing technologies there's a lot of opportunity for the people that invent those technologies, develop those technologies, or the graduate students that are working with them, to go form a business later on. And without this training, it's just more difficult. So I think that's where Iowa State Startup Factory is really helping the innovation that happens at the university grow. And then from Ag Startup Engine, there's actually dollars that come in the door from them versus just training like the Startup Factory. But in addition to the dollars that come in the door through an investment through the Ag Startup Engine, the real value for them is the network. So whether it's Farm Bureau or Next Level Ventures or any of these other groups that are part of the Ag Startup Engine, they're out really to help promote these innovative technologies in the state of Iowa, grow and make an impact in Iowa and globally. So that network's been really good to get tied into.
Yeah, there's a lot of good ideas out there. You just need someone to help lift you up. Your company's a great example of that. What's next for Grosswen Technologies?
Yeah. So we're kind of at a really cool part of the business where the initial, since 2016, it's been focused on, let's demonstrate this technology works. Let's collect a lot of data, and so we know how it works in different situations, scale it up. And now, over the past 2 years, we've been deploying commercial projects, and that's exciting. We're actually out treating water to meet water quality permits. We have a number of projects in the state of Iowa. We have projects in the state of Washington. We had one in the state of Maine. We have projects in Singapore, France, Netherlands, Japan. So we're now expanding from just being this really Midwestern focused technology. And don't get me wrong, that's still a focus of ours, but expanding to all these opportunities. Water quality is a global issue, and it's really just expanding in these different markets now and growing the business from a sales, but also just an installation base.
Are you doing anything with the algae? Are you selling the algae?
Yeah, so right now we're taking the algae, harvest it off the system, and we actually buy it from the city. So we actually pay the cities for the algae, and then we make it into a slow release fertilizer pellet. So think of like, if you've heard of the product Milorganite, it's a turf fertilizer. So so think of like Scott's, push little broadcast spreader that you'd fertilize your lawn with. We basically produce that same product, but with algae. That's a lawn fertilizer. That's our primary product.
Yeah. And is that in stores now?
Yeah, so you can contact us. We sell as much as we can direct to consumer. So maybe someday when we need more channels to get rid of it and sell it, that it could be in stores. But contact us if you're interested in that product.
If we have any budding entrepreneurs listening to our podcast, what advice do you have for them?
I really think like tying into the networks that are available. I came out of Iowa State, ecosystem, but if you aren't tied to a university, there's these startup accelerator programs. Some are great, some aren't, but they all come with a network. So I think get tied into a network of people that have been through it before and that can help advise you. I think one thing about the startup ecosystem in the state of Iowa is it's really supportive of each other, and you can get advice pretty easily. So I think just go have those conversations, get tied into a community, whether it's the Ag Startup Engine type community or some kind of accelerator. That's been really beneficial to us.
Yeah. Well, Martin, thanks for taking some time to join us. Anything else about GrowSwen that you can tell us? Or
there's 4 projects that are going in small towns in the state of Iowa. So I know a lot of your listeners live in these small towns. So if anyone has a water quality treatment need and want to talk with us, we're happy to have a conversation and see if this algae-based water treatment solution is a good one for the small town that you live in.
And you're pretty easy to find online, a pretty good website, things like that.
Yeah, our website's pretty easy to remember, just algae, algae.com, algae.com. If you have a question, just throw us an email there, and yeah, we'd be happy to get back with you.
Thanks, Martin. What stood out for me in that discussion is that if you have a great idea for a startup, just like the one Martin had, Iowa is a great place to find the support you need to make your dream a reality. And if you're looking for someone to get you pointed in the right direction, I know that Adam Kompas and his team would be happy to help with that. And again, you can reach them by heading out to renewruraLiowa.com. Okay, the final topic for today's episode is Iowa's Grain Indemnity Fund. For the first time since the 1980s, Iowa needs to start collecting fees to refill that fund. For more on that, we bring in Iowa Secretary of Agriculture Mike Naig, who recently discussed the Grain Indemnity Fund with spokesman reporter Bob Bion.
For the first time in more than 3 decades, Iowa's Grain Indemnity Fund will begin collecting a 1/4 cent per bushel fee from grain dealers starting September 1st. What are the circumstances that led to the reinstatement of Grain Indemnity Fund fees?
You bet. Happy to visit about this. This is something that hasn't happened since the late 80s. Go back all the way to 1986 and think about what was happening in the farm economy at the time. Clearly, we were at the depths of the farm crisis, and you were seeing failures of grain dealers, grain warehouses in the state of Iowa. Unfortunately, that was leaving farmers with unpaid claims. They had delivered grain, but they hadn't yet been paid. There's a failure of that warehouse, and there they sit with no grain and no check. And so the legislature at the time created this grain indemnity fund, and really I'll call it a grain insurance fund because that's what it is. It's an insurance policy for farmers that have sold grain to a dealer, a warehouse, and then have had a subsequent failure. 1986 is when it was established, and that initial assessment ran until 1989. And so that's where the grain sellers were paying that 1/4 penny assessment, or think of it as an insurance, a premium that they were paying And the grain dealers themselves were also paying a fee based on the storage that they had and the amount of bushels that they had transacted in the previous year. And so those are the various ways that the fund was actually established. I will tell you that the total fees paid at that time, all the way back in the late 80s, was $9.6 million. And during the life of the fund itself, it has paid out, though, $19 million in claims. So, how can that be? Well, it's the fund generated interest, and it also, with the department, when there is a failure, we go in and take control of that entity. We sell assets, we sell the grain, try to recapture revenue for the fund. And so really, I think you can make a heck of an argument that the fund has really served its purpose, performed very well over the course of the last over 3 decades, but we've arrived at a point where we have had, just because of interest rates and what we can generate from an investment return on the fund has declined. And we've also had, unfortunately, some failures in the last couple of years. And so the balance of the fund has now fallen below where it triggers that assessment to be run again. And that's, again, in law, all established back in the 1980s. So because that balance is now below $3 million, the assessment runs, and it'll start September 1.
Who is impacted by the reinstated fee, and how will it be collected?
So we've got those various ways that assessment is paid. It'll be assessed to farmers who sell on a cash contract basis. Any grain sold in the state of Iowa to an Iowa licensed grain dealer would be assessed on a cash basis, a quarter penny per bushel assessment. And then also those grain dealers pay a fee related to how much storage capacity they have, and they also pay a fee based on how many bushels of grain they transacted in the previous year. So those are the 3 ways that the fund is actually funded. The other thing to note here is that, out of fairness, once the assessment is triggered, again, September 1 of this year, it must run at least 12 months. And that's so that everybody pays, right? You don't cut it off in the middle of the year, and if you sold in the first half versus the second half, you don't have to pay. This is fairness. That's one caveat that we want to make sure folks know, is it'll run for at least a year.
What crops does the fee apply to? Corn, soybeans, oats?
It covers all grains marketed, again, on a cash basis in the state of Iowa. Now, typically, again, the bulk of that is corn and soybeans, but it does envision that it would cover all grains.
You touched on this a little bit, but maybe we could touch on it again. Do you have an estimate how long this fee will be in effect? It's going to be a year for sure.
Yeah, it must run for at least a year. Again, by law, as established back in the 1980s, out of a fairness, it'll run for 1 year. We aren't entirely sure where that exact number will fall, but we do think that it'll generate enough that it'll put it back above that minimum requirement. Then there may be a question about whether it should run a second year or not, just based on, again, where we land in that number. I will also tell you that there is an effort underway, and we're leading this effort here at the department, to look at, now's the time to say, this fund really hasn't been updated in any significant way since the 80s. And so it might be a time for us to look at those coverage levels, assessment levels, all those types of things. So I don't know how that will exactly play out. We're talking to a lot of stakeholders right now, but that may very well change the size of that fund. But what I can tell you is, for right now, we know that it'll run for at least 12 months. And then a decision will have to be made by the Grain Indemnity Fund Board next year at some point, whether it will run for that second year.
So you talked also a little bit about this being an insurance policy for farmers in the event of failure of licensed grain dealers and warehouses. What specific coverage does it offer to the farmers?
Yeah, great question. So again, in a situation where you've got a failure of a grain dealer, a grain warehouse, what farmers are covered for is 90% of your claims, 90% of what was lost or unpaid, up to a cap of $300,000. Now, another interesting fact is, we went back through the history of the fund. There has never been a claim that hit the cap. So think of it, it's not all of the grain that you might market in a whole year. It's just the grain that's marketed at the time, or that's unpaid at the time of the failure. And so most of the time that's well below that cap. And so again, it's 90% of the loss up to a cap of $300,000.
So let's talk about the 3 bankruptcies that we've had. To have 3 grain dealer bankruptcies draw on the Indemnity Fund in just a couple of years is an unusual situation. Is there any common thread or reason for concern regarding these certain bankruptcies?
This is a great question. As we went back and looked at these, they really are separate situations. There's no real common thread here per se, but I think what we have to acknowledge is that if you look back through the life of the fund and when it was paying out, it will not surprise you that it happens to be that it's during times of economic pressure or when you've got an economic downturn, certainly the 80s. You can think about the early 2000s, post 9/11. You can think about 2008, 2009. You can think about what's happened in the last couple of years, and you can know that that has brought just economic pressure. And so what it does is sort of push some folks towards this line and unfortunately result in some failures. I would also want to mention that our team works hard, the Grain Warehouse Bureau here at the Department of Ag. I would stress that we have a belt and suspenders approach to this whole concept. We examine grain dealers on an annual basis, and if a dealer's having financial issues and we become aware of that, we actually can go in more frequently. We're looking at their books on a monthly basis, trying to head off some of these failures. And I'm confident that we have over the many years now of the program because of that good work, because of the laws and the rules and regulations in place that require disclosure of financials. So while it's, of course, logical to focus on these three failures, I would stress that we've also prevented many of them. And that needs to continue to be a significant focus for us, is to ensure that we're becoming aware of dealers that are having challenges and that we're intervening before we have to end up in a situation where claims are needing to be paid out. So I know that we've prevented those things from happening. Unfortunately, with a downturn in the economy, we did see a couple of failures.
If someone has additional questions about the assessment or collection of grain indemnity fund fees, who should they contact?
Yeah, a very good place is going to be the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship website, iowaagriculture.gov. We've got some one-pagers, Grain Indemnity Fund 101 handout, frequently asked questions. We are, again, working to make sure that we're educating and getting information out to the grain dealers themselves. They're going to be a very, very important source of information. The folks that you're talking to when you're marketing your grain are the people that are going to know the most probably about how this is really done. And so at Agribusiness Association of Iowa, the Iowa Institute of Cooperatives, we're certainly working with organizations that represent growers. The Farm Bureau, the Soybean Association, the corn growers, all have been at the table as we've headed into this. It's something that's new. Talking to my own dad about this, I said, well, thanks for paying all that insurance premium for me back in the 80s that I've had coverage now. The fact is that there's a lot of folks farming today that have benefited from and been covered under this fund that did not pay an assessment back in the 80s. And so admittedly, I think we've got some work to do here to make sure that folks understand what this is. It's an insurance program just for farmers. Only farmers are paid out of this. Only folks that sell grain and are left with a claim, left with grain that's unpaid, benefit from this program. It's paid for by farmers and by those grain dealers. And again, I would argue it's served its purpose very, very well. And a lot of folks have never had to actually see that assessment or that subtraction come off of that check.
Have we missed anything? Is there anything else farmers should know about the Grain Indemnity Fund?
Well, I would just encourage folks, a quarter penny per bushel, put it into perspective. It's a very cheap insurance policy. I also want to stress this is not something that we came up with at the Department of Ag in the last year or so. This has been in Iowa law since the late 1980s. We are undertaking an effort here at the department to consider all kinds of ways that we could modernize or update the program, perhaps review some of its coverages. And we'll be working with folks on that and also with our legislature to potentially address any issues or any gaps or just need for changes that we see. But again, I want to stress, by Iowa law, this will come into effect September 1. And we'll be working hard to ensure that folks have the information that they need. And if they have further questions, that folks are ready to answer those questions.
It's something we haven't had to discuss too much in the past, but it's good to have that explanation from Secretary Naig. And, as you just heard him say, the Iowa Department of Ag is ready to answer the questions you might have about the Grain Indemnity Fund leading up to and after September 1st. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you found it helpful and that you'll join us for the next one on August 28th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.